In the summer of 1955, polio again struck hard across the nation. Deserted beaches became a sign of the crippler's presence.
In the annals of medical history, a haunting tale unfolds with shades of despair. A story of tragedy, reckoning, and redemption. This is the saga of the Qatar Incident, a harrowing turning point in history that reshaped the very foundations of medical regulations around vaccine development and distribution. Little did the world know, one of the laboratories producing the vaccine to cure the polio crisis in the 1950s would become the epicenter of a storm that would change the course of medical history. Before the coronavirus pandemic that would shake the world into turmoil and a life of social distancing, the polio epidemic would shake fear into the very hearts of every parent in the United States during the early 1950s. Although the virus had existed for thousands of years, it would cause periodic epidemics, including the worst epidemic in 1952, which would lead to over 57,000 reported cases, 3,000 deaths, and 21,000 people left with disabling paralysis. The polio virus causes a disease known as poliomyelitis, or infantile paralysis. In more mild cases, it can result in nausea, vomiting, headaches, and weakness. However, in the most severe cases, polio can enter the central nervous system and can lead to paralysis of limbs or respiratory muscles, resulting in death. During the early 1950s, this public health crisis transformed summers, when the virus was most contagious, into a period of confinement, as fear led families to shun public gatherings to evade the contagion. The country found itself in an urgent quest to find a cure for polio. An American physician and researcher named Jonas Salk would soon develop the vaccine that would cure the world of the polio infection. Through his research, Salk found that an inactivated or killed virus vaccine using formaldehyde would be the best option for lifelong immunity. He created the first successful polio vaccine in 1953. The vaccine was deemed safe, effective, and potent by Dr. Francis Jr., who led the experiments alongside Dr. Salk at the University of Michigan. Families across the country rejoiced as the end of this frightful epidemic was on the horizon. Mass production of the vaccine had already begun, and on the very evening of its licensing, the first batches of the Salk vaccine were shipped out. 5 pharmaceutical companies were manufacturing the vaccine. 165,000 of those vials were produced by Qaser Laboratories, based in Berkeley, California. Then, the unexpected occurred. Just 2 weeks after the vaccine release, the director of the Laboratory for Biologics Control received alarming telephone calls about 5 children in California who had become paralyzed after receiving the polio vaccine. The country held its breath. Was the vaccine truly safe? That the source of the infection was the vaccinations coming from Qaser Laboratories. All of the doses from Qatar were immediately recalled. Vaccinations came to halt. However, the damage was done. During that 2-week period, 380,000 children, mostly healthy first and second graders, had already received the Qaser vaccine. Ultimately, 40,000 cases of polio were reported, with 200 of those being paralytic poliomyelitis, and 10 deaths, all due to the Qaser vaccine. This event, the Qaser Incident, would become one of the worst pharmaceutical biological disasters in U.S. history that ultimately led to massive vaccine regulation reform. What had happened? Unfortunately, a number of errors were made not only by Qaser Laboratories, but also by the U.S. government itself, in its haste to try to save the country from polio.
A number of manufacturing firms were selected in order to manufacture the vaccine. Among them was a local privately owned firm here in Berkeley, California, known as Qaser Laboratories. They had a problem with the manufacturing process that resulted in the killed virus vaccine being made of organisms that were inadequately treated with formaldehyde, which was used to inactivate them.
A number of missteps by Kaser led to the production of the contaminated doses. It became clear that Kaser's filtration and deactivation process veered away from those outlined by Dr. Salk. In order to make the filtration more efficient, Kaser used glass filters instead of Seitz filters used by Salk. Although glass filters could have been effective, those used by Kaser were of lower quality than those used by other manufacturers. The ineffective filters allowed cell debris containing live virus to escape filtration. In addition, Kaser left the filtered solution sitting in refrigerators for long periods of time before the formaldehyde killing treatment. This allowed cellular debris to clump at the bottom of the flasks that would allow some of the virus within the debris to escape deactivation by the formaldehyde. Finally, Kaser never determined the exact time required to inactivate polio by formaldehyde, despite Salk stating the minimum requirement in his published guidelines. The government's lack of regulations and oversight into the production process enabled Kaser to make these critical errors. Evidence also surfaced that Kaser had already known that its filtration process was inadequate, as 1/3 of the produced lots failed safety tests, and they were never able to produce 4 consecutive lots that would safely pass the tests. Yet, none of this information was reported because the safety tests were not regulated, and reporting failures was never required by the government. 8 months before the Salk vaccine was licensed, Bernice Eddy, a researcher with the NIH, found that 3 out of 6 batches from Kaser contained live viruses, causing paralysis in monkeys. However, her findings were buried and she was demoted. The licensing committee approved the vaccine in less than 3 hours without this critical information. Eventually, the failures were identified and rectified. Mass production of the vaccine resumed and new regulations were put in place. Over 400 million doses would be administered by 1962. And polio would be eradicated in the US by 1979. The Kaser incident would become a major turning point in history for vaccine regulation. Detailed and stringent regulations were instituted on all vaccines, including procedures for filtration, storage, and safety testing.
Our policy has been safety, not speed, except as the latter is compatible with safety.
The number of oversight committees grew exponentially. Vaccine regulation would eventually become more rigorous than almost any medical product created for children. Currently, the average time for research, development, testing, and approval of a vaccine is 10 to 15 years. The licensing process alone is at least 1 year in length, with an average of 60,000 pages of material to review. A total of 60 lawsuits would be filed against Kaser related to the contaminated doses. However, the verdict of the first lawsuit, Gottstanker versus Kaser Laboratories, would affect the research and development of vaccines for decades to come. In that ruling, they set the precedent that pharmaceutical companies could be sued even if they were not negligent, since they followed government regulations, but were still responsible or liable for the effects of the vaccine. The Kaser incident in litigation had the unintended side effect of fewer pharmaceutical companies developing and manufacturing vaccines over the years due to the high liability and cost, juxtaposed to small financial gains. This can be seen by recent shortages in flu and COVID vaccines. As time has shown, history repeats itself. The COVID pandemic demonstrated striking similarities to the polio scare of the 1950s, including widespread fear, social distancing, and an urgent need for a cure. The U.S. government's Operation Warp Speed to develop, manufacture, and distribute a COVID vaccine in as short amount of time as possible shares its roots with the polio vaccine. Fortunately, the regulatory changes by the Kaser incident helped prevent history from completely repeating itself by avoiding a public health scare of its own making. The Kaser incident demonstrated how a negative event was the turning point that catalyzed positive safety regulations for society. Kaser Laboratories, once a symbol of innovation, became a cautionary tale, paving the way for a cultural shift in how the medical industry approached safety and accountability. The narrative changed from speed at all costs to a more conscientious approach, placing patient safety and public health at the forefront. The Kaser incident, as tragic as it was, became the impetus for a new era of medical regulation, a legacy that continues to shape the landscape of healthcare to this day.